Welcome everybody. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad to be here. You understand that most people who have physical symptoms have not made any connection between the mind and the body. Even those people who have made a connection between the mind and the body aren't here because they haven't taken the step of saying, I'm willing to do what's necessary to get rid of my pain. I'm willing to do what's necessary to get rid of my symptoms. I'm willing to take this step, and it's precious few people who are willing to do that. You are among them. So that's why I'm glad to be here. That's why I'm privileged to be able to speak to you about this. The work that we're doing is a three-part class, as you know. First class consists of the talk, this lecture that I'm going to give you, and then we're going to break into the exercises, the workshop part of the session, where you're going to do the work. Most of the people who come through this class get better. Most of the people get better. Sometimes quickly, sometimes a little bit more slowly, sometimes over time, but most people do quite well. Even some of the people I have been able to follow up, finally I hear from them a few months later and they say, oh yeah, by the way, I'm doing great. And I never even knew that. The work is based on the work of Dr. Sarno, and I've worked with him, and he blesses this class, and he knows what we're doing here. And so I'm going to go into the talk. The reason that I call it tension, a lot of people call it different names. I continue to call it tension myositis syndrome because that's what Dr. Sarno calls it. And that's the term he coined about 30 years ago when he started this program at NYU in New York City. And so I continue to call it that. A variety of people have different names for it. We call it the mind-body syndrome. Some people call it psychosomatic. Some people don't like that term. They call it the P word. Oh, you shouldn't use that term. But psychosomatic just means that the mind affects the body. The people who have it aren't crazy. How do I know that? Because I'm not crazy, and I have it. So what is TMS, tension myositis syndrome? It's a medical diagnosis. It needs to be made by doctors. The people in this room, I've examined you or I've talked to you. You know that you don't have any serious medical condition. People who may be seeing this online need to be checked by their doctor or need to be assured that they're healthy, that there's nothing seriously wrong. And that's why we can do this work. And that's why medical doctors need to do this work. The pain or the symptoms that you have and that I have at times are very real. They're not imaginary. They're not in your head. They're not an illusion. But they're in the body, but the source and the perpetuation of the symptoms are in the mind. And understanding that and accepting that is the most important thing that I can convey to you and the first step to getting better. What is TMS not? It's not malingering. It's not just stress. It's our reaction to the stress. It's nothing to do with being crazy or incompetent, as I mentioned before. It's not secondary gain. It's not because you want to be sick. And it's not imaginary. Symptoms are real. They can be extremely severe. And that's what most of us don't really understand, and doctors don't understand. How can pain or symptoms be that severe, but yet not be a serious medical problem and still be caused by the reaction that we have in our minds? That's the amazing thing. I've been a doctor for 30 years. For 28 of those years, I had no idea that this could be the case, that these symptoms could be so prominent and yet get better so quickly. And that's the beauty of this, is that once you understand this and work with it, you can get better almost overnight. Not always, but often. We have current epidemics in our society, and they've been made worse over time. Low back pain, fibromyalgia, which began in 1971 when a group of doctors got together and codified it and said, okay, this is what it consists of. And then it begins to take a life of its own, as we'll see. Carpal tunnel syndrome. How come we didn't have so much carpal tunnel when people were typing really fast on these big typewriters, and now we're just moving our fingers with the computer keyboard, and now we have much more carpal tunnel than we had then? Doesn't make sense. All the headache syndromes we have, the irritable bowel syndrome, the stomach pain syndrome, the pelvic pain, interstitial cystitis is a new thing, right? I didn't have it when I went to medical school, never heard of it. And all of a sudden we have these epidemics of young people having urgency and difficulty with bladder function in young people. Why all of a sudden? Again, it doesn't make sense. And it's really instructive to understand the history of mind-body medicine, or the history of psychosomatic medicine. And when you look at the history, you look at the 1600s and the 1700s, people would frequently have paralysis. People would frequently have seizures that were due to mental stress. And we know this by looking at the history, and there's a great couple books written about the history of this. In those days, it was considered that these were real. These were organic problems. And when medicine, and as medicine progressed, those went away. Now we very rarely have someone who gets paralysis or seizures due to stress, due to the reaction to stress. And that doesn't happen nowadays because doctors know that it's not true paralysis. We have the testing, we have the examination to prove that it's not paralysis. And our minds choose to have syndromes that are real. Nobody wants to be thought of as crazy. Nobody wants to be thought of as having, and that's why the P word, the psychosomatic word, is pejorative. That's why people don't like it. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand what I'm saying? The unconscious mind will choose a syndrome which is very real. And it will choose syndromes which run in families. If headaches run in your family, you're more likely to get headaches. I was talking to someone the other day who was had a history of neck pain. And his father had a history of neck pain. And that's how the mind works. So nowadays we don't have paralysis and what they used to call hysterical seizures. Now we have pain syndromes. And Dr. Charcot, famous doctor, one of the most famous doctors in history, in France he had a hospital where he studied people, and he studied multiple sclerosis and syphilis and strokes and things like that. But he also had a large number of people with mind-body disorders or psychosomatic disorders in his clinic in France. And what he did, he started categorizing these disorders. So he said, oh, these people come in, and they were often young women who were, relatively healthy, and they would come in and they would have, and he would say, oh, then they get these funny sounds in their throat, and then they would get these seizures, and then they would get this pain here, and he would write it all down, and pretty soon everybody started having that. It was contagious. He wrote it down, he expected it, and that's what happened. Somebody would come in who was new, who didn't have those symptoms. He would tell them, he would expect that they would have them because he would have it all written down, and then they would develop them. Does you understand what I'm saying? It's amazing how these things are basically contagious, and the mind produces them. And so what's happened in the last 100 years, it's really shifted from paralysis to pain. That's why we have so much back pain. We have more back pain in this country than in developing countries, where people are doing much more heavy lifting, much more heavy labor. We have more back pain. And so nowadays, and fatigue, because no one can prove you're not tired. No doctor can prove that we're not tired. No doctor can prove we don't have pain. And so the mind chooses those things now to make sure that it's real, because we don't want to be thought of as being crazy. That would be the last thing we would want to happen. But it all happens on an unconscious level, and that's what we're going to get into. Let's talk about whiplash for a minute. You're all familiar with whiplash, right? Everyone knows it's real, everyone knows it exists, and what is it? Everyone would say you get hit from the back in a car, your head goes back, whether you have a headrest or not, and the muscles of the neck get stretched or sprained or strained or whatever, and then you get pain or disability or headaches. And how long can whiplash last? They did a study on this in Canada, and they asked people, how long do you think whiplash would last if you had this scenario? And they said, weeks, months, or years. So there's an expectation that whiplash might occur for years. Well, in Norway, there was a researcher, and at the time, there was about 40,000 people on disability for whiplash in Norway, which is a huge number of people, considering there's only 5 million people in the country. And he went to another country where they treated people differently. Because if you're in Norway and you get in a car accident, you go to the hospital, what do they tell you? What do they tell you to do the next day?
You might have neck pain.
You might have neck pain. You might have whiplash. Go home, rest. Put a heating pack on it, or put some ice on it. Wear a collar, right? So he went to Lithuania, and he studied people in Lithuania after car accidents. In Lithuania, what do they tell you to do after you have a car accident and your neck goes back?
Go back to work.
Exactly. They tell you, go back to work. So what did he find? He interviewed 200 people in Lithuania who had been in car accidents and 200 people who hadn't been in car accidents. There was no difference between the amount of headache, neck pain, or disability in the people who had been in car accidents versus the people who hadn't been in car accidents. What does that mean? It means whiplash doesn't exist in Lithuania. There's an article in a journal in one of the Canadian medical journals. It says, the title of the article is Cure for Whiplash, 1 ticket to Lithuania, please. Because it doesn't exist there. But it exists here because we believe that it exists. We expect that it will occur. And that's what we find. I have a very good friend, very nice, charming, wonderful, bright lady who was in a rollover car accident, had a lot of bumps and bruises, went to the emergency room, x-rays were negative, nothing was broken. 2 or 3 days later, she started getting neck pain. And the pain got worse and worse and worse. And a year later, she's in tears. And she's been through physical therapy and acupuncture and massage, and no one can help her. And she's wearing the collar, and she's walking around like this, and she's in tears. And one day she was at a party, and someone said, you know, you might want to read one of these books by Dr. Sarno. It's a good friend of mine. She said, what have I got to lose? She picked up one of his books. This was several years ago. She read the book. She started doing some simple exercises. 10 days later, her neck was fine. What did she have? She had fear. She had the fear and the anxiety of having the accident and the expectation that she might get this thing that we call whiplash. And she got it. But she didn't have a serious problem. Nothing was broken. But that pain and that spasm can last for a long time. And the other thing is, it didn't matter when this study, it didn't matter if people had a headrest or not. It didn't matter if the car was totaled or not. It didn't matter if they were wearing seatbelts. It didn't matter what the speed of the accident was. None of those things had any effect on whether people got pain or not. The most important aspect about whether people got pain or not was if there was an expectation that they would or wouldn't have pain. This is an amazing, amazing study. This was done. Doctors and lawyers don't often, get along. Well, this is done in a legal journal. There's a lot of litigation, right, around whiplash. There's a lot of litigation. I just got called the other day about by an attorney who there was a guy who was hit by a postal truck. Well, he's been in pain for a long time now, and he's suing. And so they did this study where they put people in a simulated auditorium. And you know how they have these amazing special effects where in the simulated room it can seem like anything is happening to you. You'll be flipping upside down, or like you're in a roller coaster, right? Well, what they did is they simulated a car accident. like you would get whiplash, right? So they simulated getting hit from behind in a car accident. So the people in the room felt like that's what was happening to them. But their neck didn't move. Okay? Neck did not move. Not an inch, not a centimeter. So, but they had the sensation of being jarred. So what happened? Well, after the, quote, accident, 18% had neck pain. 18% of people had neck pain right away, even though their neck didn't move. At 3 days, 20% had neck pain. And 4 weeks, 1 month later, 5 had neck pain. That's 10% of the people had neck pain 1 month later, even though there was no real trauma to the neck at all. What's causing this pain? What's causing this pain? TMS. The mind expecting to have pain. And what was fascinating in this study, the people who had pain were the ones who were most stressed or distressed at the time in their lives. So if an accident occurs at a time in our lives when we're stressed, when things are going on in our lives that are stressful, we're much more likely to develop a chronic pain syndrome than if we're not stressed. Okay? It's very important.